In this short presentation, I will be discussing true cognates, describing and exemplifying both identical and semi-cognates, and how they can be used to help language learners. So what are cognates? Cognates are words that are the same, nearly the same, or at least recognizably the same in two or more languages, and cognates present an advantage to language learners. A person learning a new word in a target language that contains cognate words with a language that that person already knows is able to take a very good guess at the meaning of many words without ever having seen them before. This can make vocabulary acquisition and overall language comprehension much easier. Cognates can be either identical, meaning they are the exact same word in two languages, spelled the exact same way, or semi-cognates, also known as near cognates, meaning that they are similar but not exactly the same word. For example, without knowing very much Spanish, an English speaker can probably guess the word for antibióticos and its meaning. Antibiotics, of course. So antibióticos and antibiotics, while not quite identical, are cognate words in Spanish and English. Can you guess the word meaning pasaporte in Spanish and its translation in English? Right, passport. What about aceptar? This one is a verb in its infinitive form, which we know by the AR ending. Did you guess accept? If so, you're correct. Examples of identical cognates in Spanish and English are animal or animal in Spanish, canal in English, which is canal in Spanish, escape in English is escape in Spanish. They're spelled the exact same way, so thus they are identical cognates. In fact, English and Spanish share many cognate words. About a third of the most frequently used words are said to be cognate due to their Latin roots via the influence French has had on English, and even some Greek and Germanic roots as well. So this provides a lot of help for Spanish speakers learning English or English speakers learning Spanish. Once you get used to learning languages and looking for these similar words across languages, you can get very good at guessing, which can be a great learning strategy. And you can become familiar with patterns as well. For example, you'll notice that the sion endings in Spanish equate to tion endings in English most of the time, like nación in Spanish is nation in English, and that nouns ending in ia in Spanish usually appear as y endings in English. Another pattern is words beginning with s plus a consonant in English, like strategy, for example, will usually appear with a prefixed e in Spanish, like estrategia, so strategy being estrategia in Spanish, etc. So there are many patterns that can be detected. Basically, if you're not sure of the meaning of a word between Spanish and English or two like languages, you can take a guess at least a third of the time, as is the case for Spanish and English, a third of the time, with relative accuracy, which can give you a huge advantage when you're learning. And this is the case for English and other Romance languages as well, which is interesting because English is classified as a Germanic language, but has demonstrably significant Romance language influence. For example, in French and English, we have bicyclette and bicycle, histoire and history, problème and problem, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, if you're studying a language that has no linguistically familial connection to one that you already speak, you can't use this strategy. For example, the Japanese word for antibiotics is kosebutsu. Clearly, as an English speaker, there's nothing in the Japanese word that might flag you to the fact that it means antibiotics in English, so vocabulary acquisition will likely come less naturally for those studying a language with little or no crossover. Of course, you always have the international loan words like internet, Coca-Cola, and other brand names like Nike, Apple, Audi, or popular words like taco, kimchi, pretzel, etc. But these words won't get you very far in carrying out a more in-depth, structured conversation. As an additional side note, Japanese actually has a term for these borrowed words, which is gairaigo, mostly coming from English, but not necessarily, and includes words from other languages. that have integrated into Japanese. So now you know that cognates are semantically overlapping words in two or more languages that may or may not be identical. To further help you identify cognates, you should know that they're often morphologically the same, meaning they usually come in the same word forms with similar parts of words. Using the antibioticos, antibiotics example again, you can see both words are nouns and carry the same Latin prefix anti, meaning against or opposed to. The prefixes, however, the suffixes, however, differ slightly with the O missing in the English word. But overall, you can see a lot of similarities in the word parts. Pragmatically, cognates are also overlapping, meaning that they are used in the same way under similar circumstances. Antibioticos and antibiotics are basically equal terms in that they can be directly translated and used in a conversation between a doctor and a patient, for example. In other words, one is not slang or inappropriate in one language, but formal in the other. So they're used the same way, and that's what pragmatics is the act of using a language in real time. Phonologically, however, we do see a lot of differences. So when we're talking about pronunciation, cognates differ almost all of the time, given the way that two languages differ and the way they're spoken. This is where cognates can be more challenging to identify, as they may look similar but sound different, given differences in intonation, tone, stress, rhythm, etc. But listening for cognates is a skill that can be developed. There's usually still enough overlap for that guessing strategy I mentioned earlier to work pretty well with experience. Recall the earlier examples of the orthographically identical cognates in Spanish and English: animal, animal, canal, canal, escape, escape. Clearly they look the same, they're the same words, but they are pronounced slightly differently. In Spanish, animal carries the emphasis on the final syllable, or the palabra aguda, acute accent style word in Spanish, but in English it's on the first syllable. Canal comes close, but as you can see in their phonetically written forms, as you can see here, they look similar, but they're not phonetically identical in both languages. And escape or escape, while meaning the same and carrying the same syllabic emphasis, this word in the two languages has a few phonetic differences, and most notably that short A sound in Spanish, escape, compared to that long A sound in English, escape. And then also, just as a side note, note that in its infinitive form in Spanish, escape diverges slightly as the reflexive verb escaparse, and note that morphological difference there with the reflexive portion added to the end. But it carries enough similarities in English that even without a lot of context, you would probably be able to guess the meaning or see the similarities. So cognates fall in a spectrum of identical to similar to barely recognizable, having originally come from the same root word but evolving significantly over time. So there's a range to consider here. But truly it's a subjective matter in many cases, as what one person would deem cognate, another person, depending on proficiency level, because proficiency influences cognate recognition, meaning with higher level proficiency, higher rates of recognition. And so what one person would deem cognate, another person might not. Can you guess what gato means in Spanish, as an example? It never occurred to me that this might be cognate with cat in English, but a colleague once mentioned to me or suggested that idea to me, which I thought was interesting because I'd never actually made that connection. But gato and cat can and do stem from the same original word, so they are cognate, but if they're detected as cognate is another matter. But just another last point, just remember that cognates don't necessarily work across multiple languages. They may, like in the case with casa, in Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, it's all the same word in all three languages, spelled the same, an identical cognate across the three. So it works in that case, but you can imagine a Spanish speaker trying to learn French, or vice versa with the word gâteau that I mentioned earlier in gâteau in French. So they might find that surprisingly those two words are not the same. And this pair of false cognates, gato and gato, in Spanish and French leads to my next video on false cognates, so you can check it out if you're interested there. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any comments or thoughts or stories to share, please feel free to do so in the comments below. Thanks.